This lecture follows the end of the High Classical era and the beginning of the Late Classical, which corresponds with the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. The Late Classical era in general is going to follow the decline in Athenian dominance in the Greek or Athenian Empire and the rise of a new approach to the arts. This era is going to be marked by the end of the Peloponnesian War, with Sparta decisively defeating Athens, and will last until the death of Alexander the Great, when Greek hegemony and power will stretch across the largest empire the world has ever known, from Western Europe all the way to modern-day India. In the Peloponnesian War, we find that Athenian dominance is going to cause hostilities between them and the other city-states, specifically the militaristic Sparta, who are not accustomed to being told what to do by others. They go to war with Athens over a series of decades and eventually win this war. It is called the Peloponnesian War because it is primarily fought in the Peloponnesus, the southernmost area in the Greek mainland. Now we find that Athens is going to retain control of their maritime empire and trade, but are going to decline in political and military dominance. After a brutal set of wars, Athens eventually recovers their independence, but never again regains the dominant position in Greek civilization. They retain the reputation, however, as a center for artistic and intellectual life with the founding of the first academy or university. Now, we are going to see at this time the transition from the 5th century BCE Greek understanding of the universe during the 400s, when we have high classical sculpture such as the Doryphorus here being created, the Parthenon being built, showing us that humans impose order, or they believed could be imposed their order, on the universe surrounding them, and they could understand the world mathematically and intellectually. This is when they're going to be creating perfect statues using correct mathematical formulas for every bit of their decorative and mechanical efforts towards engineering feats like the Acropolis, and then of course understanding commensurability in statues like we see here. The standards of Phidias and Polykleitos, these great sculptors from the classical era, are going to focus on ideal proportions and idealized forms, trying to show the most perfect human form that could possibly exist, because the perfect individual is God-like. This will give way in the late classical era, from 400 to 323 BCE, to an abandonment of this ennobled, calm detachment. We find that now we will be focusing on the emotional, the expressive, and storytelling narratives. And we find that all of the elements we're going to be discussing now draw us in because they all relate to us on a very human scale, on a very human level. This is when we find humanizing forms of gods and men alike, of fully nude women finally. That is no surprise that they're going to evolve and develop at a time in which the emotional approach to things is going to be the primary motive and vehicle. The first example of this new humanizing approach to sculpture can be found at Olympia, where we already looked at the site of the Olympic Games and the temple to Zeus. Next to it, we are told in the temple of Hera at Olympia, Pausanias, the 2nd century historian, tells us that Praxiteles carved a Hermes and infant Dionysus, and it was in this temple that we find this sculpture that breaks from classical tradition. In 1875, such a statue was actually recovered. However, it is a copy, as one can see, given that it is carved of marble, and it's going to have additional supports at the hip of Hermes here. In it, we find there is a new canon, or a new ratio or set of proportions for the figures, and a new approach that specifically humanizes these gods in a way in which that they had not been in the high classical period. Here we're going to find that two figures are going to be all that is needed for communicating this narrative. The Praxitelean approach here, refined over several decades, is going to have a figure that is approachable, that is fleshy, languorous, and human. The story that is associated with this sculpture is that Hermes happens upon the infant Dionysus in the wilderness. He was left here after his mother was burned alive, being tricked by Hera, Zeus's wife, into making love to her in his godly form. And she was burned alive during the process, but her infant son survived, which Zeus then sews into his thigh. And that's why Dionysus is known as the second or twice-born god. Here we find that this is when Hermes finds this infant in the wilderness, but they are interacting. It is part of a story, not only of him taking this young god to Olympus, but also interacting and engaging with each other. For we note that the hands of Hermes that are missing and that of Dionysus would have held grapes over the future god of wine. And so very appropriately and tenderly and affectionately playing with this child also foretells what he will be responsible for in the future. Therefore, it is a narrative portrayal, a point in the story, as will all of the examples we will look at today, which is distinct from, very different than high classical understanding of sculpture. For we find that in order to understand and humanize someone, one of the best ways is to put them into a context, or doing something that we all would understand, we all could relate to, such as the anecdotal detail of the candid portrayal of interacting and engaging with a child. Here we also are going to have textural differentiation used, as the flesh, hair, and draperies all are treated very differently by Praxiteles. Along with the additional sensuous languor, this is central to understanding the Praxitelean style, for we have a softer fleshiness to the figures that are now shown. He leans on the tree trunk here, so he does not support himself. Thus we have an exaggerated S-shaped curve to the body, whereby the contrapposto places all of the weight on his right leg, allowing the left to relax as his body sways in one direction. This sensuous languor is going to appeal to the eye, not the mind, or appeals to our sensual understanding of figures and a physical understanding, not an intellectual one. Now the smaller head scene here, which is of course going to be accompanied by a longer body, is much more sensuous and sinuous in this way. So this is generally reserved for female figures previously. For the longer a body is, the more effeminate it tends to appear. Thus again we could understand the comparison between the Hermes and infant Dionysus and that of the Doryphorus figures that are nude, standing in front of us and presented as the perfection of these figures, one being an Olympic athlete such as Achilles, this demigod and hero, the other a god himself. But now we understand them very differently. We consider the perfection mathematically of the Doryphorus, whereas we find an emotional appeal draws us towards the Hermes. Turning to Knidos, we have a very important temple and statue that would show us the new direction that Greek art will take in the late classical era, specifically relating to female nudity. Here, the high classical period is going to hint at the naked female body with the thin, wet drapery technique that is going to cling to the body, but not show it. This will give way to full and complete nudity in the late classical period, starting with the goddess of love and sex herself. Now, while Alexander is spreading Greek culture, language, philosophy, religion throughout all of the known world, the style that develops must also be able to communicate to a vast array of peoples, of various tongues, ethnicities, nationalities, beliefs. And the easiest way to do that is through an emotional appeal. And that's what we find is developing here, which will become Hellenistic art, that being Greek art in this way. So here we have Praxiteles and his Aphrodite of Knidos from 350 to 340 BCE. It is a Roman marble copy after a Greek bronze original, and we can tell that because of the jutting section of marble from the hip of Aphrodite to the jug here, the Hydra vase. This is the first of a well-known sculptor to depict a fully nude woman, because before this had been a sign of low class or character. There is nudity in Greek art before the late classical period with women. However, it's only in slaves and or those of the lowest class. Comparing this to how goddesses were shown in the classical age, we find that we are now entering a new phase of eroticism and of narrative storytelling. So nudity, as seen here on the left, is going to be seen in the same type of subject in which we find a woman has disrobed. We find that Aphrodite, the goddess of love and sex here on the right, is holding her garment, her peplos, with her left hand as she has draped it over this vase to carry water and is about to step into the bath, just as the girl on the left is about to do the same, and then she will sponge off. So in the late classical era, we find that the female nude is going to be developed at the same time as an emotional appeal in art in general. For the female nude is not looked upon rationally by men, but instead is going to elicit emotional and or sexual responses, which are not rational, not intellectual. And we can see in how we engage with the statues how this is different. The face, of course, in the standard central part for ancient Greek statues has a rather empathetic and vulnerable look on it, as we find the brows are parted as she stares, of course, down and out, understanding her nudity and vulnerability because she begins to cover up. Nudity here with Aphrodite is quite significant, for it has been demonstrated by Barani and others that merging this goddess together with another Phoenician goddess, Astarte or Ishtar, as it would be known in Asia Minor, is always shown nude. Therefore, we generally give the Greeks credit for inventing this ennobled nudity, but in fact they nearly adopted it from the Near East, thus taking this goddess who's traditionally shown nude and giving her this new role within the Greek pantheon. Now, as she is about to bathe in this contrapposto pose, she is going to be projecting her knee, pulling it around her body, almost shielding herself in this passively seductive way. We notice that she's emphasizing the forms of the thighs and the abdomen, the rounded nature of it. But because this is a late classical statue, she is shown as though in the process of an action, of doing something. There is a narrative here. The gesture, of course, draws attention to her nudity, just like, of course, the fact that she's holding her dress also shows that she was clothed. Now she has taken her clothes off and is shielding herself. This, of course, makes it even more erotic with this Venus Pudica pose, or a modest Venus pose, for it shows us there is something illicit that we are seeing. We are looking illicitly, almost in a voyeuristic fashion, because the woman knows that we should not be seeing her in this state. We know the effect that this had on men at the time was somewhat overwhelming, for Pliny, in his natural history again, the Roman historian, tells how some men were overcome with love, in that priests had to send more guards to this temple that it was seen in to make sure that men could not get to her at night, for they would leave stains of love on the statue. So the Cnidians, to show you how this was so appealing and how you would engage with the statue, placed this statue in an open shrine to be seen in the round in a Tholos temple. So we find that this statue is meant to be understood by walking around it. You engage with something that you walk around emotionally, sensually, physically. And so men actually masturbated on the statue. This is going to tell us how they would have engaged with this statue in what is now the area you can see in front of us, overlooking a coast. So sailors would park their vessels below, anchor them, and then crawl up the side of this hill to get a glimpse of this beautiful goddess. What this tells us is that men are no longer engaging with statues on an intellectual level, thinking about them as they had with the Doryphorus. We are not invited to walk around the Doryphorus. He's understandable only from one angle. We also need to think about the commensurability, the perfect way in which the Polykleidon style has revealed this canon in the body. We think about it. Whereas with Praxiteles and his Aphrodite of Knidos, now we find the sensuous and humanizing qualities are applied even to the gods. This is very different from the cold and aloof gods and athletes of the high classical era that are a perfection that we cannot achieve. Now they're brought down to our level, engaging with us and speaking to us in a very human way. The sculpture was very popular, for we have hundreds of Hellenistic and Roman copies that were made. We know that at least 50 survive intact today. Now, Lysippus is going to be active between 350 and 310 BCE, and he claimed to have been self-taught by only nature as his model, thus, of course, looking at actual nude figures while making his works. He probably trained near the city of Corinth, and we know that he greatly admired Polykleidos, but he has radically different proportions like Praxiteles had. A similar engagement can be seen with Lysippus, another very famous Greek sculptor, and his apoxymenos or scraper here, another Roman marble copy after a bronze original, in this case from 330 BCE. Now, the apoxymenos in the Vatican collection, the Musea Vaticani, is going to interact with its environment more radically than the first two examples we just looked at. For we find that the arm radically projects forward, lifting the right arm and pointing out at the viewer in front of him. The sculpture can be seen from multiple angles, and in fact you must walk around it in order to understand what he is doing. He holds in his left hand, in fact, a strigil, because he is cleaning himself after a rigorous athletic and/or exercising event. Here we find this athlete not engaged in a sport like that of Myron's Discobolus, performing at the Olympics, for instance. But now this is something mundane. This is after a workout. We have an activity that we all would be familiar with. Thus, it is specifically and purposefully anti-heroic. We are not showing a heroic deed or a feat of athletic prowess or a god who's going to be engaging with mortals or establishing his prominence. Instead, he is cleaning himself. Now, in ancient Greece, athletes, in preparing for wrestling matches and/or after they have worked out and want to get the excess dirt and/or oil off of their bodies, they pour additional oil and then use a scraper to literally scrape, exfoliate, and pull the dirt from the surface of the skin. So this is going to be something that we would all be familiar with living in ancient Greece had we just been to the gym. We would have seen a man scraping his arms, his legs, his chest, etc. In the example here, you have to look at multiple angles to even see what he is doing. For we find there is a radically foreshortened arm that points out at us. So we need to walk around to see that his left hand is scraping the rest of his underarm, and that he will then switch arms. So he is in the act of doing something mundane and very human that all of us would understand. The new canon that we also see developing in the late classical era is also much more graceful and sensual and effeminate, for it is 1/8 head lengths long instead of 1/7, the ideal canon for the Doryphorus. And whereas the Doryphorus is self-contained with ideal proportions that can be seen and appreciated at a distance, this new approach, which is a narrative one, demands that we walk around it, get close to it, and appreciate the sensuous appeal of the forms. In all of the examples cited so far, we can see that they are all in action. They are all doing something as part of a narrative, whether that be bathing in the male or female examples on either end, or playing with a child, entertaining an infant. They all are going to engage the viewer emotionally and physically, unlike classical sculpture before them. Here we have Lysippus and his weary Herakles, the statue that would bring him to the attention of Alexander the Great for its monumentality. Originally, this would have been in bronze, and so we have many of these heroic nude male forms, specifically of Herakles and Zeus. This one is going to be signed by the copyist, the Athenian sculptor Glycon of Athens. To give you an idea of scale, this 10-foot, 4-inch tall behemoth towers over humans below and is, of course, very imposing in his scale, over twice life size. So we do not relate to him necessarily by way of scale, but we do so in another way. Now, we know that this was made for the Baths of Caracalla, the largest and last public works projects in the Roman Empire, in Rome itself. Now, this is supposed to, like the Doryphorus, inspire vigorous exercise in whomever looked upon it. It is called the Farnese Hercules because it was owned by the Farnese family in the Renaissance and viewed in their courtyard of the family palace. We know that artists came from all over Italy to study this and copy it. It was so impressive. Like his Apoxamenos, we find that Lysippus is going to create an exaggerated S-shaped posture with an exaggerated contrapposto pose. Now, the spatial interaction is also similar, for we must move around this behemoth in order to understand at what point in the narrative we are at with Herakles. And in fact, again, this is a late classical sculpture, so we are in a stage of the narrative. Now, at 10 feet 4 inches high, we have a huge figure, but despite his rippling musculature and hypertrophied nature, and being the strongest man who ever lived, he cannot even stand up on his own. He is exhausted. He is worn out. And why, must we ask, is he worn out? Well, walking around him, we would note that he's holding apples behind his back. So we are supposed to walk around this sculpture, first to identify him with his club and lion skin that he leans on. Thus we know that this musculature belongs to Herakles. But we must walk around to know we are at the 11th labor. That is where Herakles must get the golden apples of the Hesperides. Now, this is the 11th, moving on to the 12th. Now, we know that this is a very popular story, for the Greeks represented it multiple times. Here we have a garden on the north edge of the world, guarded by the dragon Ladon or the daughters of Atlas. Either way, he's going to slay the dragon Ladon or have Atlas retrieve the apples from his daughters. He has now finished this task, either battling a dragon or holding up the sky. Either way, he's exhausted, he's worn out, he's weary, hence the name Weary Herakles. And of course, having foreknowledge of what he must do next, he would be fairly melancholic and morose. That is, in the next labor, he must actually go to hell to wrestle with a three-headed dog. But here we find that the function is the same as the Doryphorus. We are to look upon this statue, just like the Doryphorus, to inspire us to vigorous exercise. We should look like these men. We should aspire to be like them. Of course, we are never going to have the musculature of this 10-foot tall man, but we certainly can, after a rigorous exercise routine, feel the way that he feels here, physically exhausted, aching. Right? So we find that this exaggerated musculature is not natural. It is not intellectual. It is over the top. But yet it is underscoring human tragedy, that being that he's going to be burned alive in order to regain his place and return to Mount Olympus with his father. No longer in the same labor as we looked at before do we find that the figures are calm and serene, noble and detached. Now we see the pain in his eyes. We are affected by the pathos of the figure, being very concerned for his well-being, feeling, of course, what he feels, knowing that a hero is a consummate sufferer. Now we find that we no longer have the serene expression. We find that he is dejected, exhausted. And this interest in humanizing the gods is what is so popular in the late classical era. We make them relatable. We show them as humans, suffering and feeling as we do.
Here again we find the characteristics that unite all of late classical works, in that we still have a sensuous appeal to this monumental behemoth that is going to tower over us, that we still engage with him and must walk around the figure to know at what stage of the narrative we are at. And there is an emotional appeal that we have here, not a logical one. We are not thinking about the logical sequence of the labors of Hercules as he atones for the murder of his family. Instead, we are thinking about how he has suffered, because he is the consummate sufferer, as are all heroes for the Greeks. Now, in 387 BCE, we note that Plato founds a school outside of Athens. They meet on a field of grass. Hence, of course, the academy means a field, and every university now has a quad in the center. His student was Aristotle the Great, who also founded an academy. He taught the young Alexander of Macedon to become Alexander the Great. Now, Macedonia is directly to the north of ancient Greece and is a mountainous area next to Thrace. These people are going to speak Greek. They worship the same gods as the Greeks to the south, only they are on this borderland and territories that separate the barbarians to the north from the civilized Greeks to the south. So the Greeks never truly accepted the Macedonians as equal to them. And they had been fighting barbarians of so long that they had become partially barbaric themselves. In 359 BCE, Philip II became king of Macedon. He very quickly began defeating and conquering the Greek city-states, beginning with the Battle of Kyrenia at 338 BCE, where he defeated Athens. He was assassinated shortly thereafter in 336, leaving his young 20-year-old son Alexander III in charge of this vast new Greek empire. He would become known as Alexander the Great and would lead the Greek armies in a war of revenge and vendetta as they conquest against the Persians for their atrocities committed against the Greek people during the Persian Wars in 480 BCE. Now, Alexander would expand this Greek empire well beyond that of Persia, all the way to India, down to Egypt, everything that the Persians controlled and more. He did so by way of new military techniques and of technology, whereby he had sarissas, these 20-foot-long spears that he would use in new phalanx formations. With these new technologies and an army, he is going to advance south, conquering again the Persians and Anatolia, then Egypt, where he's proclaimed a god, and then he continues all the way over to India. In 334 BCE, he defeated the Persian army, then conquered Syria and Phoenicia. This was revenge for the Persian attack by Xerxes and Darius in the battles that followed Marathon and the Persian Wars that are going to have defined and begun the classical era. In 331 BCE, Alexander conquered Egypt and founded the seaport of Alexandria, a very important intellectual center that had a library and a massive monument. Here, Egyptian priests of Amun would recognize him as a god, and then he adopted this notion and appearance from here after, as we mentioned in ancient Egypt, showing himself with ram's horns. So adopted by Alexander the Great here, he is going to have been proclaimed a god, so he starts showing himself in the visage of Amun-Ra, the sun god. In the same year, he would reach the Persian capital Persepolis, which he renames, of course, the Persian city in 331 BCE. He continued east until 326 in Pakistan. They are going to arrive nearly in India. Troops refused, however, at that point to continue farther, and he died of fever on the way home in June 323 BCE. Now, he continued to experiment with new styles due to new patrons from the courts of Philip and Alexander, and these aristocrats in Asia Minor and foreigners eager to import Greek works and artists. So this style we just discussed, produced by Praxiteles and Lysippus, is going to spread throughout all of the known world in the West, from Egypt all the way to India. Lysippus, in fact, was the only sculptor sanctioned to produce official portraits of the king, for we know that he makes the official full-length bronze sculpture holding a scepter and a lance. Here we have a head that possibly represents Alexander the Great that would have been the model for it. Now we know that this is going to represent his love of Homer's Iliad, because Alexander the Great likened himself to the great warriors in the Iliad, like Achilles himself, who later claimed to be a god as well. Now he is posed in the same way as Zeus in other examples, thus of course rivaling the scale and also the power of the king of the gods. He challenges him directly, for the Roman historian Plutarch stated that on the base we had inscribed, "I place the earth under my sway, you, O Zeus, keep Olympus," showing us that he is going to declare that the earth is going to be his, and he is not shy about communicating that. Again, this statue, by definition, because he is shouting at the gods above on Mount Olympus, interacts with the surrounding environment. He looks up, his mouth is parted, he is engaging, much like later Roman portraits of orators and those that are set up in town squares, as they are holding up their hand, talking to those around them. The hair here shows us that he is a fierce warrior, for it is going to be demonstrating leonine physiognomy that all great warriors had, this tousled hair that is going to be featured in these warrior-like poses, again carried on in the Renaissance with the statue of David by Michelangelo, because it looks like the mane of a lion, hence a leonine physiognomy, for rulers, kings, and warriors all have the same characteristics associated with the big cat.
Turning to Virginia and Macedonia, an area controlled by Alexander the Great and his father before him, we have an example of something that is very rare in antiquity, and that is painting. Most paintings do not survive from ancient Greece or from ancient Egypt unless they are in tombs, and that is exactly the case that we find here in Virginia. Here we find in a tomb a painting on the wall of Hades abducting Persephone. Now, in this small painting, very rare indeed, we have an image of a god who is rarely ever depicted. For to depict him or even say his name is to invite death on you and your family, the god of the underworld, Hades himself. In the painting that you see here, a figure runs off to the left as a two-horse chariot charges out into the viewer's space, carrying on it Hades driving the chariot and Persephone, who is nude with a pink bit of drapery that's billowing behind her, while her mother Demeter cowers in the lower right-hand corner. The story of Hades and Persephone is very important to the ancient Greeks, for it explains not only what happens in the underworld, but the etiological myth that explains the seasons. For Hades spies Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, the goddess in charge of the harvest and bringing back life every spring. He then kidnaps, abducts Persephone to be his queen in the underworld. Her mother is so sad that she lets the earth die, and with it humans begin to die. Zeus then pleads with his brother Hades to return Persephone so that humans can live and we can pray to the gods and sacrifice to them. We find that Hades, in this instance, is going to trick Persephone into eating pomegranate seeds, and she must return to the underworld for 1 month for each seed that she ate. Hence we have the time in the year that her mother is sad, for her daughter is taken to the underworld, and the rest of the year, spring, summer, and fall, when she's going to be returned to her mother. In this instance, which is appropriate for someone who is young and taken before their time as well, we have Hades, shown like Zeus and Poseidon, his other 2 brothers, but with shaggier hair, unkempt hair. He grabs onto the breast of Persephone, an image in antiquity and the early modern era implying ownership of a woman. We find that he is radically foreshortened, coming out at us as he turns back to look at Persephone's mother Demeter crying off in the corner. Now, the foreshortening and interest in it began with vase painting and then transitioned into sculpture. But what it allows you to do is engage directly with the viewer, that he's literally coming out at us, so we must consider physically what is happening in the scene, and physically how they're going to be relating to us, because we must move out of the way of the horses. And just like we are in a tomb with a corpse as well, they are also showing us that they are taken and dragged into the underworld before their time. Now, rushing into the viewer's space with this dramatic interaction, we're using the same techniques that other late classical painters, sculptors, and others had used, like Lysippus, dramatically moving into our space, foreshortened out at us. This is going to force a type of direct engagement and interaction that would be used later on in the Baroque era by Bernini in his painting and or sculpture of the same scene, whereby Pluto, or Hades, the god of the underworld, drags Persephone across the threshold. She is now in the underworld. Now, we will find that this is going to be common in images relating to the battles of Alexander the Great as well, where we find that foreshortened horses and or spears are going to relate the dramatic action, the dramatic tension, and loud cacophony of sound and of clashing of soldiers here. In the same way, it is not logical. This is a physical gut reaction that we have in looking at this painting, a very emotive and evocative one.
The great battles of Alexander the Great would fall into history and be recorded as some of the most important battles and engagements that are going to rock the ancient world. Here at Pompeii, we have an example of a floor mosaic that records one of the most important victories of Alexander the Great. Here, Philoxenos of Eretria is going to show us the Battle of Issus. This one is going to be completed in 310 BCE. This is a Roman copy known as the Alexander Mosaic that is found in the House of the Faun in Pompeii. It is made up of thousands of tiny colored pieces of glass and stone known as tesserae, and it is very durable, as shown here in how it has survived. Now, here we have an emblema, or a central framed panel of this great battle scene that does not show the bird's eye view and clearly lays out who is winning and what is taking place, but instead shows us the chaos and cacophony of battle. Here we find Alexander the Great at the left is marching and chasing down the Persian king Darius III, this taking place in southeastern Turkey. Alexander is calmly riding right here with his hair billowing in the wind. Bravely, he has no helmet, whereas Darius III, with an outstretched arm, showing us a gesture of defeat, is whisked quickly behind enemy lines as Alexander charges on with the Medusa emblem on his breastplate. Here we find that the diagonals and the radical foreshortening of the horses moving into the space, the spears moving into the space, is going to show us that we are engaging with the physical space where these soldiers are all going to be clashing with one another, falling down, dying, horses trampling one another. This is very different than the battle scenes we looked at earlier on in the Archaic era. Instead, we are capturing the violence and the chaos of the scene through foreshortening, instead of placing them perpendicular to or parallel even to the picture plane. Now we're moving radically, dramatically, and violently into the scene as figures overlap as they would appear in reality in a chaotic battle scene. In the period following Alexander the Great's rise, we also have one of the wonders of the ancient world created. And here that is at Halicarnassus in Asia Minor, on the tip here of Turkey. Now, the sister and widow named Artemisia built for Mausoleus, this Persian governor, which we now get our word mausoleum from, one of the most important monuments of the ancient world. So Mausoleus gives us mausoleum, this eponymous name. The structure that resulted was so impressive it is listed among the seven wonders. Now, it is approximately 148 feet high, with reliefs on all sides of these battles that are carried out in the ancient world, especially related to the Greeks. The battles shown here include those of the Amazonomachy, as noted during the class on the Parthenon and the Acropolis. Here we have the battle between the Greek warriors and the Amazons, that fierce tribe of women who are going to kill off all of their men or enslave them. These are seen as formidable opponents to the ancient Greeks. This example shown is going to be won by Scopas and is going to influence later Hellenistic sculpture in its violence, drama, and brutality. Now, Theseus, Bellerophon, and Dionysus, as well as Achilles and Hercules, all fight the Amazons at one point in time. Therefore, nearly every great Greek warrior needs to defeat this foe and this rival to the Athenian and the Greek way of life. Now, we know that they hated men and tolerated them only as slaves. Periodically, sometimes annually, as it is said, they would engage in indiscriminate intercourse to preserve their race, where they would then kill off all the boys or blind them, cutting off their own right breasts and those of their girls, in order to show that they are more interested in war than in the maternal duties that are thrust upon them by men. In each one of these we find variously Amazons attacking and killing Greek men who are in hoplite armor with shields and bronze helmets, spears and swords. The Amazons fight with a variety of weapons, including swords as well as axes. The ferocity and the speed with which they run shown in the fluttering drapery as they are going to pounce on these Greeks who come upon them. This is the opposite of good Athenian women, obviously, as seen by the Greeks, who were expected to be submissive, sexually chaste, productive of the male heirs. They produce male heirs and preserve the family. Therefore, this is a perversion of all that was seen as proper in Greek society, and so it must be overcome. It must be defeated by men. Now, the balanced action here is actually replaced by an unencumbered dramatic movement that collapses almost like dominoes along a line with repeated diagonal shapes. So instead of the X-shaped or chiasmic composition seen on the Parthenon during the High Classical era, we now have repeated forms that topple in the same direction and the same diagonal, as you can see here. We do not have as many counter diagonals balancing out the scenes. This high relief projection also heightens the drama, which only becomes more and more pronounced as time goes on, to where we have these weapons being drawn and plunged into the enemies, showing us the action and the dramatic intent behind this artist. The same effect can be seen both in the Battle of Issus and here with the Amazonian frieze, where we find that the primary concern is not the logical placement of figures and communicating who they are, but instead showing the chaos and violence that accompanies actual battle scenes. That is not logical, that is not intellectual, but instead is understood through empathy and pathos. In June 323 BCE, Alexander lay on his deathbed, dying of fever. His generals ask him, "To whom do you leave your empire?" Alexander then states, "To the strongest." Hence we find each one of these generals believe they are the strongest and go to war with one another, dividing his great empire.
So in the late classical period, we have this sensuous appeal to the viewer's senses. We engage the viewer physically and emotionally instead of intellectually. And this corresponds with a period where the Greeks are going to lose faith in their ability to control and understand their world. Next time, we will continue on by discussing the Hellenistic period and what happens after the death of Alexander the Great, when we find that this emotional style will be sent to and commissioned in all corners of the known world in the West, in the largest empire that the world has known, the Hellenistic one.